So I'm going to try and get all of the videos for the rest of the semester up as soon as I can, so that you'll have access to them as soon as possible for your paper topics. There's going to be 3 paper topics. The first paper topic is going to be over all of the theories of mind we've gone over. So we're giving a dialectic of the development of those theories of mind, their problems, proposed solutions, etc. As of today, because today's video might be useful for that paper topic, you'll have everything you need for that paper topic. But it's also going to be the most demanding of the paper topics. The other 2 paper topics will require you sort of survey less. Still go back to what we've done before, but we'll focus on readings that are to come. So for those 2 paper topics, you'll actually have to read ahead a bit, but I want to get the videos up as soon as possible so that you'll have access to those for your proposal, for your draft, and for your final paper as soon as I can possibly get them up. So today, the 3 readings, the Fodor, the Van Gulik, and the Dretske, they're all still concerned with Davidson, or things connected with Davidson, particularly Epiphenomenalism. And they're all concerned with getting rid of this tendency towards Epiphenomenalism, to say that there are intentional states, mental properties, psychological properties that are not causal. And one thing that happens in all 3 of these readings, I think, there seems to be at times a confusion between epistemology and ontology. What we're concerned with is whether or not there really are causal laws for psychological states, for mental states, whether or not mental properties really have causal powers. And at times it seems that they fall into talking about the usefulness of psychological laws. And that, of course, is a different topic. I'm going to say that up front, and then I might come back to it. Fodor says that physicalism, of course, recognizes that there are intentional states that are causal, but physicalism, by way of identity theory or reductionism, says that when we say that an intentional state, a mental property, is causal, because that mental property just is a physical property or is reducible to a physical property, to say that the intentional state, the mental property, is causal is to say that it's causal in virtue of being a physical thing. That's how we can get around any sort of problems with mental, physical, causal interaction, because we say that the psychological property just is a physical property or is reducible to a physical property. And so while physicalism says there are intentional states, there are mental properties, and they're causal, they say they're causal in virtue of being physical. So the word qua, he uses the word qua and says that physicalism says intentional states are causal, but does not say that they're causal qua intentional states. That is, in virtue of being an intentional state. For physicalism, intentional states are causal in virtue of their being physical states. Right? And this is the issue. If epiphenomenalism is true, the causation that occurs is all physical. The mental does not cause anything, or if it causes anything, it causes something in virtue of being a physical thing. And so Fodor says, similarly to Davidson, that intentional states are causal only if there are intentional state laws. Slightly different than Davidson, because Davidson said causality requires strict laws, and there are no strict intentional state laws or psychological laws. Fodor's dropping that strict from his requirement, and that's important. And so Fodor's goal is to show that there are intentional state laws. Not that there are strict intentional state laws, but that there are intentional state laws. And he starts talking about multi-realizability. So we've talked about this a number of times. It's supposed to be a problem for identity theory, problem for laws, psychological laws, because if psychological states are multiply realizable, and we think that multiple realizability is a problem for laws. Laws don't allow disjuncts. Then we can't have laws. And he says, well, this is commonly listed as a problem for intentional state laws. The things listed as intentional states or as mental properties have more than one way to be realized at the physical level. And so we have a law that says if physical thing P1 or P2 or P3 or P4, then a certain effect, mental or physical. But that's not the form laws take. That's the line of objection that goes along with multi-realizability. But Fodor says, well, look, people think too often about science as either being physics or psychology, but there's many other kinds of science, and all of the sciences other than physics, or maybe other than physics and chemistry, are special sciences. But all special science properties are multiply realizable at the physical level. But there are special science laws. Right? So, for example, money is multi-realizable. It's realized in many different ways, both within the US and across different countries. Different currency is used. You have a gold standard, we don't have a gold standard, and so on. Nonetheless, we can have economic laws. These economic laws allow us to predict, control, and explain. But if there are these sort of special science laws in things other than psychology, and all of these special science properties are multi-realizable at the physical level, and notice I went down to talking about currency, but even that's not the physical level. I would have to actually describe the physical constitution of the paper and of the coins, right? So even if we're all using dollar bills, each of those dollar bills has a different physical realization. But this doesn't prevent us from having or thinking that we have laws of economics. But if this holds true for economics, why does it not hold true for psychology? He talks about, well, let's say that there is an event E1, and that event E1 has properties. It has mental properties, and it has physical properties. And E1, as a matter of fact, causes E2. The question then, for epiphenomenalism, right? The physicalist will say that, well, E1 causes E2 because of its physical properties. The physical properties of E1 are what explain this causal relation, not the mental properties of E1, right? So if we want to say that mental states, mental properties, psychological properties are causal, we need this causal arrow to be in terms of, because of, in virtue of, qua the mental properties had by E1, not the physical properties had by E1. So at a given point, I'm hungry, I want peanut butter, I walk to the refrigerator. What caused me to walk to the refrigerator? Event E2. Well, it was event E1. Event E1 was a certain neurological state. Event E1 had the physical properties of being a certain neurological constitution in me. But it also had a belief property that goes with it, believing that there is peanut butter in the refrigerator that would sate my hunger and so on. What caused me to walk to the refrigerator? Was it the neurological state in me, the physical properties of E1, or was it the mental, the belief state of me? And so that's the question. And then he brings in some terminology. He says, well, look, we say that a property is causal, right? The question is, well, these two properties, the mental property and the physical property, which one is doing the causal work here to produce E2? And he says, well, a property is going to be considered causal if it falls into a law that subsumes it. That is, a law would subsume it if it says that, well, properties of M1 lead to, well, a physical action, P1, right? So this is a law. The law subsumes these properties. If there is such a law, then we say that M1 is causally efficacious. It has causal power to produce the physical change in the world. This may all seem redundant, from here, he makes the move to say, well, look, there's a difference between basic laws and non-basic laws. Basic laws are laws that hold, and we do not need any explanation for what's going on here. There's no mechanism by which it occurs. They're just basic. They just do occur. That's what it means to be basic. Non-basic laws need an explanation or a mechanism that brings about this causal process. Right? And the special science laws, he says, are non-basic. They're still laws, but they require a sort of explanation or a mechanism for their realization. So then we get the question of mechanism. Now, if this is right, and non-basic laws count as laws, Davidson would say they don't count as strict laws, but Fodor's not concerned with strict laws. He said that's too strict of a requirement. All that's required for us to have a law is that there be this sort of relationship. When M1 properties occur, P1 properties occur. Maybe with some degree of error. If we can explain by way of a mechanism how that occurs, that's good, but it doesn't undermine the fact that it is a law. And then he says that, well, in the case of me going to the refrigerator, the syntax in me is the mechanism that explains the intentional law. So this belief that there's peanut butter in the refrigerator and I'm hungry leads me to walk to the refrigerator. This is a law. This law is an intentional law. The underlying physical realization, my neural state, is the syntax. It is a symbol, right? One neural state has a certain form, another neural state has a different form. Those are symbols. There are rules about what count as valid symbols and how they're combined. That I could explain how I walk to the refrigerator, why I walk to the refrigerator in terms of the syntax. But what he's doing here is saying that the syntax is just the mechanism by which the causal process between the intentional state, my desire for peanut butter and belief there's peanut butter, leads to the physical action. And then he says, well, all of these special science laws have ceteris paribus clauses. Ceteris paribus. Ceteris paribus clause says all things being equal. So, as a matter of fact, I might have M1. I might believe there's peanut butter in the refrigerator. I might be hungry, and I might believe that eating the peanut butter will make me not hungry. But it's not the case that every time I have those three beliefs, desires, that I actually walk to the refrigerator and get peanut butter. Why? Well, because maybe I think my fiancée is coming home soon and I want to have a nice dinner with her. I want to be hungry for that, so I'm not going to eat peanut butter right now. In that case, the ceteris paribus clause is not met. So the ceteris paribus clause catches all of the sort of things that would overrule M1 producing P1. So this is an intentional law, says, well, as a matter of fact, it's not a nomological necessity that every time M1 occurs, P1 occurs, but rather every time M1 occurs and the ceteris paribus clause is met, the ceteris paribus conditions are met, then P1 occurs. And this is something of a catch-all, and we might be concerned with this because laws are supposed to be law-like. It's supposed to be the case that if the antecedent occurs, the thing before the arrow occurs, the thing after the arrow occurs in a law-like fashion. But if a ceteris paribus clause says, well, when the antecedent occurs, the consequent will occur, except when it doesn't, then we have a problem. But really, what is going on with this ceteris paribus clause, I think, is that we could cash it out, and we could potentially explain all of the situations, all of the clauses in the ceteris paribus for when M1 causing P1 is overruled. We don't do this at the intentional level. Maybe we could do this at the physical level. It would be incredibly complicated. But that's okay. We know that reducing the mental to the physical is incredibly complicated. And he makes the move to talk about disjoint physical sufficient conditions. If my belief state that there's peanut butter, I'm hungry, the peanut butter will keep me from being hungry, that could be realized by one neuronal state now in me, another neuronal state in me later, could be realized by you with a completely different neuronal state. This is the disjunct problem we saw before. He says, well, this is fine. There are disjoint physical sufficient conditions for the production of P1, but the ceteris paribus clause is supposed to help us get around this to some extent. If we were to really cash this out in the physical terms, it would be very complicated. We would have a disjunct in our antecedent, the thing before the arrow, and we would have to list all of the physical things that would overrule this, and it would be very complicated. It would say, well, if N1 or N2 or N3 or and so on, and not all of these other neuronal states, right? Say the neuronal state that underlies my belief my fiancée is coming home and I want to be hungry to eat a nice dinner with her. So then at the physical level, this law would look like, well, if N1 or N2 or N3 or and so on, and not NA or NB and so on, then P1. This is a very complicated law. These conditions here would be the ones that override these neuronal states producing the physical change in the world. The ceteris paribus clause catches this and says, well, these things, that is, M1 produces P1 except when it doesn't, but that's not vacuous, that's not empty, because when we say except when it doesn't, there are these underlying syntactical neuronal facts about when it would not. The mechanism is at this level. This mechanism explains how this holds. It is the case that if M1 occurs and the ceteris paribus clauses are met, then P1 occurs. And this looks a lot like a law. This is the form that laws of the special sciences take. This is taken to be a response to Davidson. It's unclear that Davidson would accept this, right? And I'm not sure if there's something tricky going on here with Fodor, because he says, well, look, under this account, the mental is being causal. The mental is reducible to the physical, but it's being causal in virtue of being an intentional state. I'm not sure that he really drives home that point. In fact, I think he's sort of unclear whether he really wants to admit that point. But the way to try and do that is to say that, well, up front we said that a property has causal power and therefore is a cause if there's a law that subsumes it. There are these intentional laws. They take this ceteris paribus form. Since there are these laws for intentional states, for mental properties have causal power. They have causal power. So P1 is produced in virtue of M1. M1 has the power to produce P1 in virtue of the mechanism that realizes it. And that is the physical thing. So the physical explains the causal power of the mental, but the mental has causal power because there's a law that subsumes it. This law is different than this law because it takes the form of if M1 and ceteris paribus clause is met, then P1. Which is different than saying this. So he says. So then we have Van Gulik who says, well, look, I'll admit up front there are no strict physical or no strict psychological laws. He's agreeing with that point of Davidson. He drives home the objection a little bit about ceteris paribus clauses. If ceteris paribus clauses are just this catch-all that says, well, M1 produces P1 except when it doesn't, then that's vacuous, it's trivial, and that fails to make it a law. That makes it fail to be a law. But I think that Fodor thinks that, well, no, it's not the case that these ceteris paribus clauses are sort of a vacuous move to just say that, well, M1 produces P1 except when it doesn't, because the except when it doesn't could, at least in principle, be cashed out. The fact that we can't cash it out right now does not mean all we're doing is saying that M1 causes P1 except when it doesn't. It's saying M1 causes P1 except under these conditions, and I can't fully yet tell you all of those conditions. We complete science, maybe we could. Possibly. Van Gulik takes a different sort of route, and he says, and this is where I think the epistemology and ontology really gets confusing. Some confusion may be in Fodor, but with Van Gulik I think it's greater. But he says, the laws of special science, he grants that there are laws of special science, including psychological laws. They're less precise and reliable than the laws of physics, but they have their own virtues, namely they're useful in ways that physical laws aren't. If I had to appeal to this law at the physical level to predict whether someone's going to go to the refrigerator and get out peanut butter, that's not going to be very useful for a number of reasons. One, it's vast. This list of disjuncts here is huge. And even if I have experience, if I could see your neuronal state, I could see my neuronal state, and I've seen N1 and N2 and so on, and I've seen that those end up producing P1, there's going to be a long list here, and I haven't seen all of them. So I'm going to have a law that I can't apply in often cases. And I'm also going to have to know about the overriding conditions, but they're vast also. And it's likely I have not seen all of them. And there's going to be some confusion about the interaction here. I saw N1, but it didn't produce P1. But did I recognize that there was an overriding condition in A there? Maybe I did, maybe I didn't. Now, this would be very precise. It'd be more precise because I don't have this sort of catch-all of ceteris paribus. And because I've cashed out the ceteris paribus here, and is no longer a catch-all, is more precise, but it's also reliable because with the ceteris paribus clause, maybe sometimes I get it right, maybe sometimes I don't. I have knowledge that you want peanut butter, that there's peanut butter in the refrigerator, and I think that you want to have a nice meal with your fiancé, but I missed some fact about your fiancé has already eaten or something. So I think the ceteris paribus clause is going to override, but I'm wrong. And so I mispredict. I'm going to get it wrong with the intentional law more often, with the special science laws more often. But even though they're less reliable and less precise, they're more useful. And that's a virtue of special science laws. And And then Gulick sort of says, somewhat rhetorically, that, well, the point of laws is to be useful for prediction, control, and explanation. And in order for a law to play this role, it has to pick things out at the right level of abstraction. If I were to predict whether my car was going to break down, and I had to do that by observing the physical state of my car at the microphysical level, it's not going to be very useful. I'm not going to know whether my car is going to get me to work or not. If I can look at macro things, including the representation of the gas gauge and these sorts of things, knowledge I have about the last time I changed the oil and all of this stuff, that's going to be more reliable, more useful to me. It's going to be more useful to me. Not more reliable, because if I could know all the physical facts, I would not get it wrong. I might get it wrong because things happen that I can't predict because I'm not looking at the microphysical level. Nonetheless, the microphysical law is not going to be useful to me because it's going to be too complicated. I can't get that information. I can't even process all that information. So the higher level law is more useful. It allows me to predict, control, and explain with some degree of error, but it's okay because that error is offset by the increasing usefulness of this special science law. And then he says, well, special science properties, mental properties, economic properties, what have you, they pick out patterns at the physical level. Say, this collection of neuronal states. If I say someone has a desire for peanut butter, what I'm doing is picking out a group of different physical properties and saying that group of physical properties is named by this special science property, is named by the desire for peanut butter. And that picking out those properties can be useful for us as a shorthand, at least. And see, you see where we keep going to this useful thing. That seems to make it an epistemological issue and not an ontological issue, even though the issue at hand is ontological. He said, well, look, if there were a complete physical description of the world, and we could give a law about peanut butter desire, that physical description would actually pick out the thing named by that special property. So the higher level, intentional property, desire for peanut butter, that's an intentional property. It picks out state of the world in which various neuronal states are true. This just names a collection, an organization of physical properties. If I were to give a physical law, that physical law would pick out the same thing that the special science property does. This property, this disjunct property, this collection of neuronal states is the thing named by this intentional property. And so a complete physical law, complete physical description of the world has to pick out these special science properties. But it does so in a messy sort of way, right? We couldn't just look at this and know that this names desire for peanut butter without knowing the intentional property. This would not be useful to us. Not without knowing that it names the intentional property. The intentional property is useful. A complete physical description of the world picks out the same things that an intentional description of the world does. Well, it picks out the same things and more. But nonetheless, all the things that are intentional properties are picked out by a physical description of the world. Some collection of the physical properties of the world are going to be named by intentional properties. But that's going to be messy and it's not going to be useful for us. It's not entirely clear to me how we get here a defense that the intentional properties are causal beyond the physical properties. That is, I'm not sure how Van Gulik sees us as getting around epiphenomenalism. He says that intentional properties are useful for us predicting, control, and explaining the world. Fodor seems to be making the claim that, well, intentional properties are causal as intentional properties. Van Gulik seems to want to say that there's something... If we say that this is identical to, it equals, it is the same thing as the physical description. The physical description picks out properties in the world, collections of physical properties, and that is the same thing as the intentional property. It's not clear that then the intentional property, desire for peanut butter, M1, is what produces the physical change of walking to the refrigerator, P1. Why do we say that? Well, this desire for peanut butter, being that it is the same as this physical property, it is what causes P1, but does it cause P1 in virtue of being an intentional property or in virtue of being a physical property? It's one thing to say that if we just have the physical property description, that would not be very useful for us. It's something else to say that without this intentional property, we could not have a law about why P1 occurs. When M1 produces P1, it is the intentional property doing the work. It's not clear to me that Van Gulik delivers that. All right, and then finally we have Dretske. And Dretske, I think, does something similar to Van Gulik in the fact that I'm not entirely clear how he responds to epiphenomenalism. But he says, look, there's the design problem. This is how we deal with, well, I guess this is how we deal with intentional causal relationships. That we have a system S, and we want that system S to perform an act A if and only if there is a condition C. Right? And so he says, well, this is the sort of our, the innate facts about us, our habits, our reflexes, our instincts are of this sort. There's something scary in the world. There's a tiger. That produces in me a fear response, that being the C, that leads to A, running away, the act of running away. And so we have a design problem. We want people to survive in the presence of tigers. We want them to not be eaten by tigers. How do we do that? Well, we need to put in that person something C, some state, that represents with some degree of error that there is a tiger here or there is danger here. And then we need to make that representational state, C, produce the act A. If we do that, we've solved the design problem. And this design problem is true anytime we want to create a system that produces a given action. So if we want a thermostat to increase the heat when it's too cold, we need a state of the thermostat C that represents it being too cold relative to what we set the thermostat at. And then we want that system, the thermostat, based on the fact that it's now representing that the temperature is below what is desired, to produce an act A of turning on the heat. Any design problem in a thermostat, in a human, in a government, is of this sort. And those, in humans, the C is going to be, let's say, a neuronal state, syntactics. But we can't look just at the neuronal state and see that that neuronal state, C, means what it means. So in me, see the tiger, puts in me a neuronal state, an adrenal state, some sort of body state that leads to me running away. But you can't just look at that neuronal state and say that that represents there is a tiger here. You can't look at it and say this represents something that should lead to A. This is to admit that we can't get meaning from syntax. The neuronal state is the syntax. It's the language of our brain that produces meaning, intentionality. And he's granting that we can't go from looking at that neuronal state, the syntax alone, to understanding what that neuronal state C means. Nonetheless, the neuronal state itself represents, say, the presence of the tiger and the need to run away. Now, this is sort of idiosyncratic to Dretske. This is his sort of stance on meaning. He thinks that there is natural meaning in the world. Some things naturally mean other things. They're natural indicators or representers of states of the world. And so my neuronal state, my body state, adrenal state, when in the presence of a tiger, naturally means there's danger here and I should run away. But we can't look at that, well, I say naturally means, but the meaning here is very weak. It's intentional, it's meaning in a very weak way, in a way of natural representation. I'm not sure if I can make sense of what exactly this natural meaning is, but the idea is that my body state naturally means that there's danger here and I should run away. The state C of the thermostat means it represents that it's too cold and the heat should come on. And we get from this weak representational meaning of C, which is propositional in some sense, but it's not propositional enough to be intentionality. Right? We get from there to real intentionality by way of learning based on conditioning. We learn to associate certain internal representative states, C, as meaning something about the world and leading to a production of A. I learned that because in the past when I've been hungry and I've eaten peanut butter and I've stopped being hungry, that if I'm hungry and I eat peanut butter, I'll stop being hungry. And from that, I can recognize the desire, the neuronal, well, I can make it into a desire. It becomes something that's meaningful. My rumbling belly, the neuronal state I'm in when I'm hungry, it naturally represents something about me needing nutrition. But I can come to associate that with intentional things. I can put intentional content on that by way of conditioning. And so the state C produces act A because of the relational properties of C. When I'm in state C of being hungry, if I eat food, that state C goes away. That's a relational fact about C. And C comes to produce the action of walking to the refrigerator and getting peanut butter and eating it because of this relational fact about C, that if I'm in that state C of hunger and I'm given food and eat food, then I stop being in that state C, and I've been conditioned by the pleasure of the negative reinforcement of removing the displeasure of being hungry. I've been conditioned to build up something like a law, something like an intentional law that when in state C, then produce act A. And at some point, there's a whole lot that goes in here. At some point, we go from this weak meaning of representation to the intentionality of a thought about peanut butter, a thought about being hungry, a desire for peanut butter, a thought that if I eat the peanut butter, I'll stop being hungry. Those are all intentional things. Those arise through the natural representation meaning of C and its association with certain acts. And the fact that I've been conditioned that way. And so it's the natural representation meaning of a system state C that comes to explain the causal role. But because I cannot read off from C by itself what it means, then it is not C itself that's explaining if C, then A. If I'm in state C, then produce action A. That becomes a law-like relationship, but it only becomes a law-like relationship by building in the meaning, the intentionality by way of conditioning. Based on this natural fact about C, that it has certain relational properties, when those relational properties are combined, when C is combined by way of those relational properties to other C's, other states of the system, other inputs from the outside, then we build up a relationship, if C, then A. Now, notice initially, if I have a thermostat and I have not programmed it, it could have a state that represents being too cold, but it would not produce turning on the heater unless I've hooked it up right. Once I've hooked it up right, then C actually sort of has this more intentional meaning of producing A. And by way of this, because we need all of this input, all of these connections with C's relational properties to get the association of if C, then A, this is making if C, then A law-like relationship, but at the intentional level, because it does not hold solely at the physical level. Started with only syntax of C, we built up intentionality. There's a whole lot of work that goes in here that he does not really specify about how all this building up goes and how it means that C produces A in virtue of being an intentional property or in virtue of having intentional properties as opposed to just in virtue of its physical properties. He talks about relational properties, but the relational properties seem to be themselves physical properties. It's only by way of conditioning and learning that we build in intentional properties, mental properties. Only once we've done this does C actually produce A. Do we actually go to get peanut butter when we're hungry? But it still seems possible to have the rejoinder that, nonetheless, all of these intentional properties are epiphenomenal. Sure, it is the case that C initially did not produce A, but C, after undergoing certain things, did produce A. The issue there is that if we do that, then we're at the physical level, and we're saying that C causes A in virtue of being a physical thing, but there was a point at which C did not produce A before we learned about peanut butter sating our hunger. And if that's the case, then that law at the physical level itself looks like a ceteris paribus law. And so while I'm not clear exactly how Dretski's responding to the epiphenomenalist challenge, he is responding to this Davidsonian challenge of strict laws by saying that, well, even at the physical level, because C does not always produce A until we've conditioned it to do such, C carries a ceteris paribus clause. C produces A except before it has been conditioned. And so what does all of this deliver us? Well, what it delivers us is it delivers us from epiphenomenalism, assuming all of this works. Epiphenomenalism says, well, we grant that there are mental properties, whether those be identical to physical properties or whether they be reducible to physical properties, but they're not causally powerful in virtue of being intentional properties. They exist, but they're non-causal, they're epiphenomenal. But why do we say that? If both the mental property and the physical property occur and they both lead to an effect, we have to be able to privilege the fact that it's the physical that leads to that effect and not the mental. How do we do that? Well, one way to do that, Davidson said, well, there are laws of how the physical property produces the effect. And causation requires it be captured by laws. And while there are laws of the mental, those laws are not strict, and causation requires strict laws, there are only strict laws of the physical. Then we challenge this claim that we grant causation requires laws. Okay, But we challenge this idea of strict laws, and then we say, well, look, you picked out the fact that the physical property P produced the effect E, as opposed to the co-occurring mental property M producing E, because P had a law-like relationship to E that M did not have to E. So again, we have, at the same time, we have a mental and physical property occur, and we say, well, this leads to an effect E. And we say, but we can explain this by way of a causal law at the physical level, and we can't do that at the mental level. But then we have to explain how this explanation of this causation, how the causal law at the physical level is different than the mental level. Davidson says it's strict. This is not. And you have to have strict. Fodor comes in and says, well, that's not true because we take there to be laws of the special sciences and they're not strict. And so, there are laws for both the mental and the physical and how they produce an effect E. So the mental is doing causal work there. That is, if we say the causal work is done if there's a law that explains how the cause produces the effect, and there's no way for us to say that the laws at the physical level are different than the laws at the mental level, since I said causation occurs if there is a causal law, and there is a causal law at the mental level, then there is causation at the mental level. I think it may be an additional thing to say that that causation occurs qua, in virtue of, the fact that it's mental. They try here. And now, of course, there's the concern, if we make this move, are we moving back to dualism? We have to be concerned with that. There's also the additional concern. If we say that there are, as a matter of fact, we can produce a causal law that explains how the event that has property M and P produce this effect. There is a law here, and there's a law here. If we say this, then we go back to Kim's concern about, well, there's over-determination. There's more than one effect, more than one cause producing an effect. If I knock out the physical, the mental would still produce the effect. If I knock out the mental, the physical would still produce the effect. And there's something objectionable about overdetermination. What we take of that is going to depend on what we take about the overdetermination claim. Do we really think that overdetermination is a problem? If so, then we have to say something like the mental is reducible to the physical, the mental law is reducible to the physical law, there's only one law there, it's the physical law, and so even if there's a law that says M produces E, it does so in virtue of the fact that M also co-occurs with P, and it's P that's doing the causal work there. But notice, if we make the move to we have to be clear, if we make the move of reducing the mental level law to the physical level law, we're then reducing the mental property to the physical property. And then we have to question whether epiphenomenalism is true. Right? Epiphenomenalism says there are mental properties and they're non-causal. But depending on our relationship we place on the mental and the physical, if we just say that the mental are the physical, they're identical to, but they're just a different description of, then that's not epiphenomenalism at all, because the mental is just a different way of describing the physical. And so when I say there are mental properties, I'm saying there's a different way of describing the physical. And so it's not like there is something out there beyond the physical that's not doing causal work. But if I'm really in a property dualism, and say there are two different kinds of properties, and the mental is not reducible to the physical, the mental has laws that explain how it produces an effect, the physical has laws that explain how it produces an effect, and then I have a real problem. I have overdetermination, and I'm going to have to deal with either the fact that either the mental or physical is not really causal here, or that overdetermination is okay. And so there's lots of other things going on here. We've dealt with the multiple realizability issue. We were also dealing with supervenience. And we're saying that, well, look, the physical state, there's multiple physical states that realize this mental state. Multiple physical properties that realize this mental property. And so the mental supervenes on the physical. No change in the mental without change in the physical. No change in the mental law, the intentional law, without a change in the physical law. And so we have these same sort of concerns that we've had all along. And so it's sort of left up in the air about what we take to be the conclusion here. It depends on who we think has the better argument or which principles we think are more basic. Depending on whether we think that reduction is more important, the weight of multi-realizability objections, these sorts of things, how important the overdetermination concern is, that's going to determine where we fall on all of this. It's one thing to say that there are intentional state laws with ceteris paribus clauses. Those intentional state laws with ceteris paribus clauses are useful for us. That's one thing. To say that the intentional state laws describe real causation and not just a way for us to understand causation, that's something different. And so we're not going to get a great conclusion here. For one thing, it's not decided what the case is here. This is still a point of debate. We've got to this point of debate. We started with Descartes. We went through all kinds of different theories based on problems, responses to problems, and so on. We've even gone back and forth from theories. One theory was in response to another theory's problem, but then that theory was found to have problems. We got another theory. That theory was found to have problems. Maybe we go back to the other because the first problem now does not seem as bad. We have lots of things in the air, and the issue is coming up with a consistent view. If you hold laws to be required for causation, and you hold laws to be of such a sort, then do we think there's causation at the mental level or not? What does that say about mental properties? What does that say about mental substance? All of this has to be explained. What we need is a consistent set of beliefs. And lots of times the responses to one theory would say, well, look, either something in this theory is not consistent, or the things in this theory with other things we believe are not consistent. And so we've got more and more refined ways about talking, more and more types of beliefs that we've brought in, things that we think are important. And now we're looking for what is the most consistent position. And at this point, you have to just be okay with the fact that it's something of a boggler. There's weight against believing there is a mental substance. There's weight against thinking the mental is not causal. There's weight against thinking the mental can't be reduced to the physical or identified with the physical. There's weight against thinking that functionalism works and explains anything. There's the consideration about whether or not we should be all that concerned about the ontological considerations at all, or just the epistemic considerations. Maybe all we need to be concerned with is not the nature of mind, but the understanding of mind that's most useful for us. All of these things have to be taken into account when you evaluate what you think is the best theory of mind, the best theory of mental content, the best theory of mental causation. Whatever your stance is, you now have lots of tools to evaluate whether your stance is consistent. Is your stance on the nature of mind, and your stance on mental causation, and your stance on mental content, are those things consistent? All the properties of those stances, are they consistent? With Descartes, we saw he had a stance on the nature of mind, but there is the obvious intuitive fact that there is mental causation, and that can't be explained on Descartes' theory. That's an inconsistency. Here, it still seems like maybe we have some inconsistencies. We're going back and forth, back and forth. Maybe we have to live with some inconsistency because we have not completed the task of figuring out the nature of the mind, causation, and content. We're still working on it philosophically. We're still working on it scientifically. But if there is some inconsistency we have to put up with, it should be the least of the inconsistencies. If we get more evidence and then we find that that inconsistency, or there's other that inconsistency is not all that small after all, or there are other inconsistencies, then we get pushed into another theory about the nature of mind or causation or content. But what you do not want to do is adopt a theory of mind, its nature, its content, and its causation that has an obvious inconsistency with it or with other things that we obviously believe. Part of the concern here when Fodor responded to Davidson is Davidson's concept of laws does not match up with the way we talk about laws in the special sciences. No one argues against what? The usefulness of special science laws, say of economics, or the existence of the laws of economics as something above and beyond physical laws. That's a question to be answered by you. I hope to have the rest of the videos up by next week. There are 3 videos left. The one on qualia will be relevant for one of your papers. The one on naturalism will be relevant for another one of your papers. Hope to get those up next week. It requires a lot of prep on my part, a lot of recording on my part, and a lot of time posting them to YouTube on my part. So I'm going to get them done as soon as possible, hopefully by early next week.